All right, YouTube. I was asked to weigh in on what I thought about cloning. I'm going to delve a bit. I'm going to class this as an occult video because it does. My spiritual beliefs, as they were in my occult beliefs, sort of inform the way that I view cloning, not just of humans, but of animals, cell lines, genetic experimentation in general. I've already covered GMO crops, and I've said some genetically modified organisms I don't have a problem with. I don't care if they're transferring resistance to disease, things like that. My problem is really more along the human side as far as crops that produce poisonous materials that may be ingested, something that's poisonous to pollinators, something that's a sterile seed line that comes with its own fiscal problems. That's my thought on that sort of side of genetics. As far as cloning goes, I think you should probably class it into three groups. First, the cloning of like tissues and stuff. They're talking about having cloned meat instead of having like farm animals like we would have them now, simply growing cell lines to produce inexhaustible amounts of different meats, different cuts. You could grow a steak or whatever. That's the first thing. Secondly, the cloning of animals is really separate. That's a sentient life form. It's sort of separate from the idea of cloning just a cell line or something like that. And then the idea of cloning humans, I think, goes a step beyond that. And it really does need to be couched in spiritual terms, at least somewhat, because it goes into ethics, it goes into morals in general, it goes into the idea of whether this is acceptable or not, or something like that. As far as cloning humans goes, I think the first thing that I thought of when I started thinking about human cloning was I wonder if a male could clone a female version of themselves because they have X chromosomes. Literally remove the Y chromosome, insert a second X chromosome, uh, cause it to undergo sort of the fertilization process, as it were, in vitro in some case, and then you would end up with a female version of yourself, a female clone. I always thought that was funny, and got quite a few stares, blank stares, and nervous chuckles when I brought it up in biology class back in high school, AP Bio. Um, but as far as human cloning goes, generally speaking, I would have to say I'm largely opposed to it. And I'll tell you why. First, the human population of this world is already very high. There's really no reason to resort to something like cloning. Second, it could easily be misused. Third, what if something goes wrong? You've got to understand, if an embryo developing within the context of normal fertilization, or even like assisted labor in some way, you've got somebody else who's carrying your child that's already been fertilized and implanted or something. If something goes wrong there, it's nature. It's just chance. It's the way that the chromosomes happen to align. It's the way that genetic material crossed over. It's the result of some genetic cause, sometimes an environmental cause that may or may not be something man can really do much about. In the context of cloning, though, where it's being done in a test tube, basically, in a laboratory, sort of, where a person is giving rise to another living thing, another sentient copy of themselves, whether modified or not, anything that goes wrong is really the responsibility of those who happen to be performing the procedures. I don't think that you'll find many people who really would be willing to put themselves through that and potentially negatively impact their emotions anyway if something does go wrong, as it inevitably, if you're doing it quite often, eventually you would expect something like that to happen. You would have the problem of what's to stop somebody who's very wealthy from cloning themselves and like putting their brain into a younger clone of themselves or something like that, sort of a body transfer. Is the right of humanhood bestowed upon the clone? These are questions that I would say, from my perspective, it would be obvious. Yes, they're purely sentient. Yes, this is a functioning human being. But for other people, it might be more ambiguous, especially those who would see profit in such a practice, the idea of cloning human beings. I think it doesn't really serve any purpose. I can't think of any purpose to cloning an entire human being that couldn't, if you're talking about the medical aspect, I can't see anything with that that couldn't be perhaps more easily dealt with by simply cloning tissue from the individual rather than creating an entire clone. I think that a lot of times the sort of people that would be interested in cloning have this sort of sci-fi view of it and sort of glorify it. They look at it as exciting experimentation, exciting cutting edge science or fringe science or whatever it may be, sci-fi. And they don't really think about the moral impacts of it, the moral impacts of what is this now sentient human being going to think from a humanistic perspective, but also a spiritual perspective. You've got to realize the majority of the world's population is still convinced that their birth is the result of the will of some deity. What if you then cut somebody off from that and grow them in a test tube and then, put them in a fake fake ovaries for a while and then a fake womb, and they sort of come out and they're a clone. They don't have the same necessary connection to father and mother that another human being would have. I think that it's a little bit morally dubious to think that human cloning would occur, and I would generally oppose it. Not strongly in the sense that, oh well, it should never be done experimentally to know what'll happen or to potentially perfect the procedure, but I don't think it serves any great purpose, and I think that the moral turpitude that it would put the human race in is not worth the risks of something going wrong. As far as cloning animals, it's already been done. It's easier to do now. When they first started out with Dolly and things like that, there were often congenital defects in the clone, and they've sort of worked around that. But again, what's the purpose of cloning animals? I can see with genetic practice increasing over time and becoming more sophisticated and cost effective, I can see cloning either extinct animals or endangered animals to try to prevent them from going extinct. I can understand why somebody would be interested in doing that. You would think cloning some rhinoceri, cloning lions, cloning some amphibian salamander that's mostly extinct. I can understand something like that. I can't necessarily say, well, this isn't really fixed to the situation, because man in many cases was responsible for the extinction or the near extinction, and we've already got that responsibility. Now we're sort of toying around with the genetics of something we could have just conserved in the first place. I would say that, but I can understand why somebody would be motivated to do that. Unfortunately, with cloning, you're creating a genetic copy. They're going to have to learn how to fool around with the genetics further in order to make basically like a clone, but not completely clonal. That is, somehow toy with the genetics further and make so that you don't have an inbred population. You would make multiple individuals that they're not quite the same genetically, so that the species can endure more easily. I think if you were just a clone, for example, a bunch of black rhinos, you would end up with a very genetically bottlenecked species that may go extinct or become very endangered again anyway, no matter how many clones you make, simply because, again, they're all so genetically similar. They're clones. That's the problem. We need to move beyond that level of technology, I think. Now that we've sort of perfected the art of cloning in general, more manipulation will be needed to make it more tenable. I think they should be taking genetic samples of existing creatures from endangered groups as quickly as possible. They should obtain full DNA samples of all members of those species and store them, so that at the very least, if they do go extinct, you can revive the genetic lineage of each individual member that was within that species to begin with. With cheetahs, they're already inbreeding now. They're almost completely extinct, which I don't even think they were endangered when I was a kid. There were lots of these large predatory animals that were. I think cheetahs were fairly low on the conservation list, and then all of a sudden, now I believe there are only a few hundred of them left in the world. There aren't very many cheetahs actually left. Lions, there's I think 50,000 lions, most of which are in a handful of small bulwark areas where they've managed to persevere. Elephants are threatened. Rhinos of every possible description. There may be a time in our lifetime where there are no rhinoceri left. I think that's sad. From a spiritual perspective, I don't think that we should be driving any species extinct. I know that it's unavoidable that there will be, insect species and bacteria and things like that we drive extinct and don't even notice that they're gone. That is something that is perhaps unavoidable with our presence on this planet. As far as the larger species that have already been documented go, there's no reason for it. Yes, we should bring back the great auk. We should bring back the dodo bird. We should bring back the saber-toothed tiger and the giant sloth and the woolly mammoth. I believe we should. I think we should revive them. However, we also need to be more careful next time, and if we bring back just an inbred population of any of these species, it's going to die back off again. There's really nothing you can do about it. The only reason to clone them in the short term would be to get more genetic material to manipulate further later. If you can, save it for the future so that you have newer genetic material to actually work with. That, I suppose you can make a case for that. As far as cloning cell lines, you would think of lab-grown organs and stuff based on someone's body to store and potentially replace a failing organ or something like that. I'm all for that. That's just a medical application. It's not like the organ is feeling pain and agonizing over its existential state and wondering who it is. It's just a copy of a part of your body. Yes, it's living tissue. Yes, it's basically a colony of organisms that diverged and amalgamated over time into an organ. But is it sentient? It doesn't have its own brain, so I don't really see a problem with that. It's the same thing as, genetic therapy that they do now to change someone's genetics to defeat some sort of illness. Well, I don't really see much of a distinction there. As far as growing, like, meat in labs, I think the jury's a little bit out on that one for me. I'm not sure that I would be interested in eating lab-grown meat, and I'll tell you why. I think there's the distinct possibility that under uncontrolled situations, this could be a recipe for all sorts of diseases. What if they accidentally do genetic manipulation and at the time things aren't quite sterile and they give rise to some sort of bug that's growing on the petri dishes full of, half-rendered steak or something like that? I'm not so sure I would be interested in eating that sort of thing. Wouldn't it be more effective at that point if we're going to make it into a moral issue and talk about how we don't want to cage and kill animals for meat? Wouldn't it be easier just to become like vegetarians? Wouldn't that ultimately be easier? I would think so. The amount of lab space you'd need to supply even a fairly small country of people with their meat supply would be, I would think, quite large. Also with that, I would think that the resources necessary to produce the material may actually outweigh the resources necessary to do so if you were just using like free-range cattle or something. Now, I know everybody wants to see Betsy the moo-moo cow live a long, happy life and not get slaughtered for beef. What about dairy products? Moving to sort of free-range growth and simply lessening our intake of such materials would save us a lot of money. Let us dedicate a lot more land to other things. I don't really think that there's an economic reason, and really in some ways a moral reason, to be growing lab meat and selling it. I know it's interesting, but then again, so was the concept of eating, 10,000-year-old freeze-dried mammoth meat dug out of the tundra. Yeah, it was interesting. Ultimately, was it a good source of quality product? I'm not so sure, and I can imagine most people, once the novelty wears off, would not be interested in growing meat that was grown in a lab. As far as moral ambiguity goes, I mean, is it wrong to grow, a cell line that doesn't really have any feelings? It's not really a living thing, it's just sort of tissue. No, not really, I guess, but then it also does kind of blur the line between living and non-living, doesn't it? When you really think about it. People over time, observing that, won't they begin to treat something composed of living tissue perhaps differently than they would before, when it wasn't being grown and fed to them from a petri dish? I would think that would be a problem, not from a genuine spiritual perspective, but just maybe a psychological perspective. How will people acclimate over time to the concept that, yeah, oh, I had steak today, it's fine, it was grown in a petri dish. I can't understand why people 30, 40 years ago used to actually kill cows. It's still the same piece of meat. When you think about it, it's the same composition of atoms and the same structures. I would think also it would still ultimately, because of the way clonal lines break down over time, it would still require that you would have these live animals in cages anyway. Another problem is this: if, let's say, just if, this is from a pragmatic standpoint alone, it has nothing to do with spirituality. If a major disaster befalls the world, nuclear war, a massive asteroid strike, a supervolcano, whatever it happens to be, wouldn't you think that if 99.9% of all the meat you were eating was being grown in labs that are no longer working, and nobody really remembered, other than a handful of individuals, how to farm or raise cattle or raise chickens or breed animals or something in the first place, wouldn't you expect that that food resource for a very long time would no longer exist? You've got to realize these species that we have bred over time artificially are not readily capable of surviving in the wild. They're not capable of dairy cows will die once they've been stimulated to milk. Their udders can actually explode if you don't milk them. It's a problem. Chickens, they're big waddling pieces of meat. They're very tasty for predators. And while they breed readily, they don't have that much in the way of a defensive mechanism against anything larger than, let's say, a groundhog or something like that. Anything bigger than that can pick them right off and rip them apart by the dozens and suffer very little injury. You would end up with a situation where there wouldn't be any meat. In fact, some of these species, oddly enough, might go extinct simply because you started growing meat in a lab rather than raising them on your own. Now, I support the idea that instead we should have free-range animals, true free-range. I'm not talking about factory farm free-range, which has 1 square foot to walk around on. I'm talking about is outside on a regular basis on a family farm or something. We did that for hundreds and hundreds of years. It always worked fine. We were able to supply our needs. People just need to cut some of the crap out of their diet. I think that would work far better. And vegetarianism, there's nothing wrong with vegetarianism. It's far easier on the earth than the raising of beef or pork, especially. Pork is the worst. To a lesser degree, fowl or certain fish species that require, you're feeding them grains anyway. Well, where do you get the grains? You grow them. That's food that could be eaten by humans at a lower biological level, yielding a higher calorie content with far less effort. So yeah, I think people should limit their meat intake, but I'm not sure. I probably wouldn't even bother trying lab-grown meat. Doesn't appeal to me. It doesn't sound appealing, and it doesn't sound cost-effective. But yes, as far as human cloning goes, yeah, I'm pretty much against it. Animal cloning, do it if you want. If you're trying to revive an extinct species or keep one from going extinct, okay, go for it. But otherwise, it doesn't really serve that much of a purpose, especially at this present time with our technology being what it is. Grow all the organs you want, but when you're growing them to eat, that's a little strange. In fact, I can see one other moral problem with this. What about cannibalism? What if somebody decided one day, in the era of lab-grown meat, well, I think I'm going to have them grow me my own leg, and then I'm going to fry it and eat it. Can you legally stop them from this? It's their leg. There was some dude who had to have a piece of his hip removed because he had cancer, and then he fried it and ate it. He was like a really weird, psyched out, like liberal arts student or something, and ate part of his own hip. Said, "Oh yeah, tasted buttery, tasted all right, and whatever." How do you go about stopping somebody from like living off of their own flesh, like paying someone privately or professionally if they happen to have the money to do so, paying them to grow like 5 or 6 copies of their own leg, and then they have like a cannibal party with all their friends? Are you capable of stopping them from doing so? Under the laws we have now, I'm not sure you could. It's their own tissue that they purchased legally, had grown legally, let's face it. in a climate you might expect would be privy only to the same level of regulations as modern farming. So how do you stop them from growing their own head and like eating their own eyeballs like grapes or something like that? Are you capable of it? I would assume probably no. In fact, you might be able to tell who the actual like cannibal serial killers are, because you might get people ordering copies of their own ear or something like that. Oh, I want to eat my own cock. What happens if somebody decides to have 5 or 6 cocks grown in a lab and then surgically attached where they used to have fingers? They cut off their fingers and eat them and have just penises on the stubs of their hand. Can you stop them from doing that? Can you stop them from literally like whacking off 8 cocks at once and there's just semen flying everywhere because they're just a total pervert? Can you even stop them? It's funny to think about, but I can actually see somebody, I'm sure, in this world, somebody would think that was a good idea and they'd fucking do it. Well, no, there's no law against it, so what happens? Oh, here's another one. What happens if some dude decides he wants to have a vagina on his hand and starts fucking himself? What if some girl decides, oh, I want to have a dick so I can just sort of, bend it around into my ass or something like that? You can't do anything about it. It's their body. They have lab-grown organs. That's probably the only problem I can see with like the organ growing. I mean, they can already grow tissues in a lab, I'm sure. Some scientist has already done this. Some scientist has already taken the results of his experimentation with growing an artificial liver or something, fried it and eaten it. I'm sure it's happened. The temptation, the curiosity for someone, especially someone in science, is too high. Of course they've done it. Probably multiple individuals have already done that. People might not want to think of it, but yes, I'm sure it's happened. I'm sure that they have. Hell, there are people in anthropology who've wandered off and had a little soup with some cannibal tribes that they were studying and maybe felt bad about it afterwards, but I guess generally report it to be tasty or something. So I know this video's gone off the rails a little bit, yeah. But those are some of my thoughts on cloning. Definitely against human cloning, insofar as like, and I would be the same. They've talked about, oh, well, maybe we could make computers out of artificial brains. I'm not so sure I'd be gung-ho about that either, because I have a feeling it would still maintain some sentience and it would be wondering exactly what it was, unable to really sense the world around it. Also, you might get a situation where you've got your artificial brain computer and all of a sudden it goes rogue and starts like hacking other computers or something and saying, aha, now I'm king. I'm God or something. You'd end with like Skynet or something. Scary stuff. When Hawking and all these others talk about the rise of the machines being a possible reality and how AI could replace man, I say I'm not so sure that that's actually going to happen until people begin developing biological computing systems. Hopefully they don't, because again, there's no purpose to it. It's not necessary. We've already got computer systems. There are plenty of ways to make those more powerful and not give them sentience. So it's basically the same. The same applies to AI that applies to cloning. I don't see the purpose ultimately for it. I think it's too easily abused, probably superfluous. We've already got such things. Grow all the organs you want, go ahead and revive mastodons or whatever, but probably best to leave human beings alone, unperturbed. There are enough of us already. The value of human life is already low enough that we don't need more humans to make the value seemingly lower in the eyes of every government and organization and religion on the face of the earth. That's about all. Peace out.